Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Blair Forlaw, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the third in a series that's being presented by the Freedom Forum. We entitle our series Religious Resolve, Stories from Our Past for Our Future. We're grateful to the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations for making this series possible through their generous support. Our program today takes place at a time in America's history when there were deep divisions about race, religion, and freedom. There was confusion over the difference between fact and fiction in the newspaper, and on top of all of that, there was a raging epidemic that was taking people's lives. Now, if these themes from 1721 Boston sound familiar to you, then you know why we are drawn to the story of Onesimus, Reverend Cotton Mather, and America's emerging free press. Understanding our past prepares us to envision our future. Our moderator this afternoon is Dr. Deborah Mason. She's Professor Emerita at the Missouri School of Journalism at the University of Missouri and a leading scholar of how religion is portrayed in the media. She directed the Religion Newswriters Association for nearly 2 decades and is publisher emerita of Religion News Service, an award-winning source of global news on religion, spirituality, culture, and ethics. Dr. Mason is a religious literacy and the professions fellow at Harvard's Religious Literacy Project and a faculty member at the Religious Freedom Center. Deborah, welcome and thank you for moderating our program today.
Sure. Hi, thank you, Blair, and thank you for being the engine behind making this event happen. And until Tuesday's debate, I thought being a moderator was an easy job. Well, a deadly disease, racial injustices, failure to believe the science of prevention, issues of religious freedom, fake news, and competing visions of what a free press should be. As Blair mentioned, you can't get more timely than this. But first, a few housekeeping details. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. You'll all be muted during this presentation, which will take most of the hour. We'll try to get as many of the questions as possible, but the authors have agreed to stay on after the hour for an extra 15 minutes to try to answer as many questions as we can. Also, we'll have some additional resources listed for you at the end of this conversation if you'd like to know more about this fascinating story. As you know from the publicity of this program, this story of Onesimus received some cursory attention when the COVID-19 pandemic first emerged in the United States. And even in August, MSNBC broadcast a 2.5-minute story about Onesimus. It's the story of an African enslaved man who was inoculated for smallpox in Africa and who taught the Puritan minister, Reverend Cotton Mather, the technique, just as a deadly smallpox epidemic hit Boston in 1721. The arguments about inoculation, that is vaccination, became central to the birth of the New England Courant, founded by Benjamin Franklin's brother, James. James's paper opposed inoculation and operated without royal authority to do so. Our program today will look at less well-known aspects of this story and seek to answer questions such as, how did other Boston religious and medical leaders react to Reverend Mather's promotion of the African medical technique? And how did Benjamin Franklin get involved? How did the ensuing confusion lead to the development of Boston's first independent newspaper? And what happened to Onesimus after Reverend Mather finally gave up on converting him to Christianity? Well, today we have 2 wonderful presenters who are steeped in this history, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. Tom Meenan served as a museum tour guide from 2014 through the museum's closing last year. He's a graduate of Georgetown University, and he worked in IT support at the U.S. Senate for over 32 years. Major projects there included providing real-time news access for Senate staff going as far back as the 1980s, and launching the first Senate website in 1995. And a long time ago, he almost won on Jeopardy! That was in 1996. Our second guest is J.L. Bell, a Massachusetts historian who studies the coming of the American Revolution. He's the author of The Road to Concord, How Four Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, that book and many other articles. For 14 years, John has maintained the daily blog, Boston 1775, which is, as he describes it, quote, history, analysis, and unabashed gossip, end quote, about the people of the 18th century New England, including Onesimus and Cotton Mather. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah and Blair. Today I'll be discussing a few topics. The smallpox outbreak in 1721 Boston, a campaign at the same time encouraging Bostonians to be inoculated with live smallpox virus, a vehement reaction against this baffling practice and against those who were advocating for it. And in direct response to this controversy, the creation of America's first really independent newspaper. In each of these topics, we'll look in detail at the role of religion and religious resolve, and conversely at varying degrees of secular frustration with religious figures assuming leadership roles in issues of public policy. And also within each of these narratives, I'm going to focus today on the ways in which racial notions of the era and put simply varying flavors of racism entered into the mix. These are obviously complex topics. I'll do my best to skim the surface here today, but I'll try to lay out the broad issues. And the chronicle I'm relating today considers early 18th century views and comments, some of which are offensive to our 21st century ears, but I think have to be heard. And on the first slide here, you can see Boston Harbor about this time. Our story today begins in Boston, 1721. Smallpox was known in England at the time as the speckled monster. It was to the 17th and 18th centuries what the plague had been to the Middle Ages. It was considered the most fearsome of all infectious diseases. And in 1721, about 1/10 of all deaths and up to 1/4 of all cases of blindness were caused by smallpox. Boston had endured earlier outbreaks of smallpox and other diseases, so you can pretty easily imagine the abject terror that was spreading through the city as rumors began to circulate following the arrival on April 22nd of a naval frigate, the HMS Seahorse, sailing from the West Indies and alleged to be carrying the speckled monster. At that time, Boston was the third largest port in the British Empire. It was roughly 4 square miles and had about 11,000 residents. As far as the religious sort of lay of the land at the time, there were 4 main church groups that can be identified in Boston and surrounding areas. There was the Episcopal Church, which was supported by the governor, his appointees, and the richer merchants in town. You also had the conservative Congregationalists and Presbyterians. These would have been supported by the Mather family and other older families, and these were the successors to the first generation Puritans. Also had the Quakers and more liberal Congregational churches, which were supported more by small tradesmen and artisans, and then rural Congregationalists as well, various sects, who were mostly supported by farmers, agricultural people, and they were pretty distrustful of citified religious leaders of any stripe. We'll move on now on the next slide to introduce the major players in our story today. We have, as you see on the upper left, Cotton Mather, a third-generation Puritan minister, civic leader, well known already by then for his history at the Salem witch trials, witchcraft. He was also a man of some scientific knowledge, and he's the primary figure calling for prophylactic inoculation with live smallpox. In the center of the image, and really at the center of our story here today, is a graphic. Unfortunately, we have no images of him, but a graphic representing Onesimus, who was an enslaved member of Mather's household. He was given to Mather in 1706 by his congregation. And through Onesimus, Mather first learned of the practice of inoculation, which was widely used among West Africans of the day, including Onesimus, who had a visible scar from the procedure. In the bottom left, we have Zeb Bill Boylston. He was the son of a trader and a pharmacist living somewhat on the frontier of Boston. He was a medical practitioner of the era, although at that time there was no formal medical training available in Massachusetts. He learned through apprenticeship with others. He was a great uncle of President John Adams, and he joined Mather in an ambitious and controversial program advocating inoculation. The book title in the upper right corner is from William Douglas. He was a Scotsman trained in Europe, Boston's only medically certified doctor when he arrived in 1716. He was adamantly opposed to inoculation and enraged by what he viewed as clerical overreach in the public sphere, evidenced clearly in Mather's advocacy for it. And also in the bottom right, we have James Franklin, public printer, Boston born, but apprenticed in London. He and others established Boston's third and only really independent newspaper, the New England Courant, in direct response to the inoculation program. We'll be hearing more about the Courant and the team of anti-inoculators who produced it, and they came to be known collectively as the Couranters. There is one other figure, as you can see in here, which is Benjamin Franklin, and I love this image here. I call it the Fightin' Franklins. James's father arranged for an apprenticeship in his print shop in 1718, when his 12-year-old younger brother, Benjamin, began working in the print shop. And yes, it was a contentious relationship. We'll hear more about that later. So now we'll go into more detail on Cotton Mather. And he was a grandson of renowned religious figures, John Cotton and Richard Mather, the youngest ever graduate of Harvard College. He considered a career in medicine, but opted to pursue sort of the family business, I guess, as it were. He was not the most likable of historical figures, though a complex figure to be sure. He was a stern third-generation Boston Puritan minister, closely associated then as now in the minds of most Americans with the Salem witch trials, which had been some 30 years earlier. And Mather was trying to put that behind him. He did regret it at this point. I think that's part of our story today, maybe one of his motivations. He was surprisingly modern in a number of ways. He was well-read in science. He was a fellow in the very respected Royal Society, headed by Isaac Newton. He was broadly criticized for being too credulous of almost anything he read. Biographer noted that he had an encyclopedic rather than an open mind or an original one. So it might have been good on 18th century Jeopardy, I don't know. But he was not an original thinker, alleged to not be. In December of 1706, the congregation gave Mather an enslaved household member, as I mentioned earlier. He named him Onesimus after an escaped slave befriended by St. Paul in the Bible. Mather observed his scar, and he learned through that about inoculation. And he spoke with other Africans who had the practice, the procedure, and he also was fascinated by a prominent 1716 journal article about inoculation in a science journal. So he was prepared at this point, and even around 716, he sort of knew what he wanted to do if there was another outbreak, as there would be. This was in part deeply personal for him. There was a measles outbreak in 1713, which killed his wife, his newborn twins, another daughter, and the family's maid just within the space of a few weeks. Mather embarked with Boylston on a prominent program beginning in late June 1721, encouraging Bostonians to accept inoculation with live smallpox. The general populace, the government, and a good bit of the religious community was up in arms. They found it counterintuitive, dangerous, speculative, even an offense to God. We can actually, we can go back to the to the earlier slide, I think. Anyway, cut one more before that. Yeah, we can just stay on that one. That's good. We'll just leave that one out. Mather embarked on the general populace, the government, and a good bit of the religious community was up in arms. They found it an offense. In the middle of a November night, in fact, there was a grenade thrown through Mather's window. The fuse separated, fortunately, it didn't explode. But a note attached to it called Mather a dog and noted, "I'll inoculate you with this, with a pox to you." As far as Mather's theology and inoculation, he rejected the views of some that illness was a given punishment from God that must be accepted. Regarding his research of an African medical practice, which many derided because of its origin, he saw no reason. We can just leave the Mather slide up. That's good. I'll call for the next one. Thank you. Regarding his research, he saw no reason, quote, "why a Christian may not employ this medicine and humbly give thanks to God's good providence in discovering of it to a miserable world." In fact, Mather said of persons who had any inclination to accept inoculation, that the sixth commandment, quote, "requires him to use it," underscoring his view of the procedure as something of a Christian imperative. His father, Increased Mather, said of inoculation, "They keep not in good terms with the sixth commandment if they do not do it." As far as Mather's racial views, theories of race and racial ideology, which were well entrenched by the later 18th century and certainly the 19th century, were emerging in this era, perhaps more so in Europe than in the colonial setting. And it must be said from the outset that regardless of any of his positive statements, Mather was a slaveholder. He never embraced the equality of all. My personal view is that he was maybe a bit of a tortured soul in some respects, especially in his racial views. His logic often seems somewhat tortured, and he'll take some steps in a promising direction and then shut the door or make a patronizing or belittling remark. So it's kind of one step forward and a couple back. But more than most of his contemporaries, and yes, the bar was quite low, he admired Africans and was open to hearing about their lives. In 1702, regarding earlier epidemics and the effect they had on local Indian populations, Mather had some pretty harsh words. He noted, referring to the Indians who had died, "The woods were almost cleared of these pernicious creatures to make room for better growth." He was in no way an abolitionist, but some consider him arguably a kind of early American assimilationist of sorts. He devoted more thought to issues of race than many of his era. He wrote pamphlets specifically addressing African Christianity, including the Rules for the Society of Negroes, published in 1693, The Negro Christianized, published in 1706. These included a paraphrased version of the Lord's Prayer, which he said, quote, "may be brought down into some of their capacities." And he wrote two catechisms, a short one, quote, "for the Negroes of a smaller capacity," and a longer one, quote, "for those of a bigger capacity." In one pamphlet, I think quite appallingly, he noted that it was, quote, "the providence of God that sent Africans into slavery, where they could learn from their masters of the glorious gospel." He told slaveholders they had responsibility for the general welfare of enslaved workers, with an emphasis on conversion. And at times he excoriated those who neglected enslaved household members. He provided a school to teach Africans reading and writing, again with an emphasis on religion, in particular scripture reading. But he also assured slaveholders that baptism and conversion did not emancipate their property. On the contrary, he argued, and again, this is some of the tortured logic many find, he argued that religious instruction and conversion were perhaps the best means of legitimizing slavery's place in Puritan society. Mather held that Africans were rational human beings with useful knowledge about the natural world, but he did not see their mental prowess as up to that of white Europeans. As far as motivations behind the project for Mather, we certainly can't rule out at the top of the list Christian charity. Mather frequently practiced acts of Christian compassion. And although it's probably at the top of the list, it's not the only factor, and he's always a complicated guy. As I mentioned earlier, he was at this point anxious to overcome the legacy of his involvement in Salem. He also kind of wanted to reestablish the good old days primacy of a theocracy, in which he viewed religious leaders such as himself as holding legitimate, divinely ordained public leadership roles. And also, he may have wanted to fortify or reestablish the dominant role of Boston, Massachusetts, in an environment where other cities and colonies were sort of shaking up the status quo. Onesimus I'll move on to Onesimus now. I'm delighted to have J.L. Bell with us here today because he's going to expand after I speak regarding Onesimus, but a few more words about him. In the centuries following up until 1721 itself, really up until the dramatic growth of African studies, I think in the mid-late 20th century, Onesimus' contributions didn't garner a lot of attention from historians. Unfortunately, that has changed. We know that Onesimus could read and that Mather wanted him to write as well, though he may not have reached that skill. Mather early on acknowledged he was a pretty intelligent fellow. We know he was married later in life. Evidence indicates that he and his wife lived in their own household. He lost at least 2 children, which was the kind of bond that he had with Mather, who lost 13 of his 15 children in his lifetime. Mather opted to allow Onesimus to buy his freedom in 1717. And once again, it's a bit of a mixed message from Reverend Mather. He also required Onesimus to repay funds Mather alleged to get stolen. It's not clear if he did or not. And these funds were used in part, and no small irony, to acquire a young enslaved African. And again, Mather did attach another provision, which is that Onesimus was required to help him with periodic household work, such as shoveling snow and hauling wood. Onesimus never accepted Christianity, which was a mark of shame. And some of the time, some in Boston rather, found this a predictor of possible bad fortune for the Mather family. When I say mark of shame, I mean on Mather himself. Some said it predicted bad luck, and indeed Mather did suffer a lot of setbacks later in his life. Seemed to almost welcome death when it came. And as we can see on the next slide, and I'll just call for the slides from here on out, thank you. But on the next slide here, it's as you can see, I mentioned earlier how Onesimus was all but ignored to some extent by historians of an early era. But in 2016, Boston Magazine engaged prominent historians, city leaders, and its general readership to identify the 100 best Bostonians of all time. About 400 persons were nominated and voted on, and as you can see, at number 52, they named Onesimus, identifying him as the slave who saved Boston from smallpox by teaching inoculation. Moving on to a little bit about Boylston. He was familiar with native Indian medical practice because he grew up on the frontier. I think it's now more, you can just leave, I'll call for the next slide. Just leave the previous one up, thank you. He grew up on the frontier. Now it's more or less Brookline, not that far from Boston, but as a result of growing up with a lot of interaction with Indians, he respected non-traditional approaches. And this open-mindedness played a role in him becoming the physician involved in this quite experimental project. He said, quote, "I don't know why 'tis more unlawful to learn of Africans how to help against the poison of the smallpox than it is to learn of Indians how to help against the poison of a rattlesnake." He inoculated whites as well as Africans. He noted that Africans generally got less ill from the procedure. He carefully recorded facts about the inoculation project and included data on persons of various races, but he generally did so without the kind of racially charged invective or commentary, often in others' writing of the era. And we can go to the next slide now, which is we're moving on to William Douglas, an anti-inoculation letter written in a pseudonym by Douglas. Scots-born Douglas was Mather's staunchest opponent. He even carried on his critique of Mather after he died in 1728. Mather embraced inoculation as a kind of mysterious gift from God, while Douglas dismissed it as quackery that promised to do more harm than good. The objections of Douglas and of the current years were they weren't really opposed to religion as such, but they were deeply resentful of religious leaders appropriating broader public leadership roles, and they saw none more dangerous than Mather's, what they considered deadly experiment with inoculation. Douglas had no recorded church affiliation, and he viewed Christianity more as a constellation of principles and ethics rather than an engagement with the transcendent. He completed his studies first in Edinburgh, followed by formal training at medical schools in continental Europe. And he received his medical degree in 1712. And as you see, the next slide shows some additional publication by Douglas. He was often immersed in controversy. He was driven, obstinate. One called him an excellent hater. Another observer said of him, he was always positive and sometimes accurate. He was dismissive of non-scientific methods. He rejected the concept that science and medicine might be advanced by practices or knowledge emanating from beyond Europe's shores. He was a very proud European. He was particularly scornful of Mather, whom he called a credulous, vain preacher. He said Mather's diary is a treasure trove to the abnormal psychologist. He labors to acquire the possessions of a scholar, but he listens to old wives' tales. He said his mind at 14 had reached the limit of its growth. And he also said of Mather and others, and this one I think he's right, he said to be more or less book learned is not a sufficient qualification for a physician. It's kind of the core of his complaint here. He played upon fear as well as bias against Africans, inciting the general public to advance his anti-inoculation agenda. He accused Onesimus and others of fabricating their experience with inoculation. He noted that they, quote, tell us now, though never before, that it is practiced in their own country. He wrote many highly satirical pieces skewering the practice of inoculation and discrediting Africans' medical knowledge. This was the age of great satire of Pope and Swift and others. Douglas' attempts at satire strike me as a bit lame. They tend to be one-note observations pretty much about how others are beneath him, certainly Africans, but also much of Boston society. Commenting on a regional Indian uprising, Douglas composed a highly satirical document, The Project for Reducing the Eastern Indians by Inoculation. He recommended that troops be led by inoculators armed with lancets, walnut shells, and lymph, who would infect and thus defeat the enemy. And he also suggested he had a role for Cotton Mather specifically in this program, which would be Major General Inoculator. He accused Mather and others of other religious figures of overplaying their authority, quote, like the Roman Catholic clergy of old. They would have the people believe that they are the only proper judges in all cases of literature. He disdainfully referred to Africans as, quote, the good people in Guinea, and, quote, those judicious people called Africans. In fact, he belittled even the use of the term African, noting that they were, quote, by others called Negro slaves. He was maybe something of an early conspiracy theorist. In one instance, he even accused Africans of being false liars, speculating that the whole inoculation program might have been nothing more than an African conspiracy to overthrow their masters. He pointedly compared Indian medical practitioners, which he called powwowers, to gospel ministers, apt officiously to intrude in the office of a physician. Later in his career, after he came to accept inoculation as a valid treatment for some, he actively discouraged women from being inoculated. So a bit of some issues with sexism perhaps as well, sort of implying that women were weaker. And also some ageism issues, maybe. He suggested rather that women should, remove themselves from an infected community, inferring that they were perhaps weak. And regarding younger people and older people, he noted that teens should not be inoculated, quote, while their juices are in a juvenile fret. And similarly, regarding anyone over 45, he didn't think they were a good candidate, quote, because their juices become rancid. Even after accepting inoculation, though, he still accused Mather of extravagant recommendations, unsupported by sufficient experience. And moving on now, on the next slide, we see James Franklin. Franklin denied using the New England Colon to combat the inoculators, but the very first issue of it promised to shed light on a certain set of men who, like faithful shepherds, take care of their flocks by preaching and practicing what's orthodox. Pray hard against sickness, yet preach up the pox. Subsequent issues stated outright that the publication's chief design was to oppose the doubtful and dangerous practice of inoculating the smallpox. There were many anti-matter contributors to the Courant. One noted that the Reverend author was defending inoculations with, quote, equivocations, mental reservations, and Jesuitical evasions. Many, many such insults and much worse thrown in at Mather in the Courant. And after the epidemic subsided in 1722, the newspaper moved on to other issues of the day. And lastly, a few other points about Ben, like others of his generation, Ben Franklin, like others of his generation, and keep in mind in 1721, during the outbreak, he was 15. He questioned what role religious authority should play in determining public health policy. He was a major, albeit rather mysterious, contributor to the New England Courant, most notably using the pseudonym of a fictitious widow named Silence Dogood. His brother James never would have allowed Ben to publish his own name, or if he'd known Ben was behind it. And there are many fascinating stories behind Silence, quite the beloved figure. As referenced earlier, Benjamin had a famously difficult relationship in the service of his brother. He sort of skipped town, as it were, in 1723. He broke the contract of service his father had set up with James, and he found his way first to New York and then to Philadelphia, and as they say, the rest is history. Like a number of our founding fathers, Ben Franklin had a complicated relationship with religion. In the year of his death, 1790, he wrote, "I believe in one God, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we render to him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is mortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. As for Jesus of Nazareth, I think the system of morals and religion as he left them to us the best the world ever saw. But I have some doubts as to his divinity." And one last comment I'll close with. The Franklins and the band of vehement anti-inoculators known as the Courantiers were generally considered quite progressive and had a very progressive agenda. And as you'll see on the last slide I load here, I point to an advertisement. We'll load the next slide. There we go. It's an advertisement that ran more than once in the Courant. And here's an example from the July 17, 1722 issue. And as you can note in the second entry, the advertisements promoting the sale of an enslaved African. We don't know for a fact who set the type for this issue, but it very well likely might have been Benjamin Franklin. And if so, there's a great irony in this because Franklin later in life became a committed abolitionist, and in 1787 presided over the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. And I'll close with another aside while we have that graphic up. If you look at the block of text, a large block of text towards the third advertisement, this is kind of an interesting aside about how interconnected lives were in Boston in 1721. The third advert you see here references a runaway Irish slave, Irish indentured servant, William Tinsley, who left the service of Josiah Franklin, a tallow merchant. Josiah was the father of James and Benjamin, and Tinsley's service was actually acquired to replace Ben when he moved on to be an apprentice with his brother. And apparently Tinsley hated candle producing as much as his predecessor Ben did. They both hated the job. Tinsley skipped town, as did Benjamin a year later, and there's no evidence that Tinsley was ever located. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And now we'll move to John.
Thank you, Deborah. Blair invited me to be part of this forum to talk about Onesimus, a much smaller focus than what just Tom talked about, which went into the religious and economic and the journalistic side of colonial Boston. Onesimus, as an individual, we know only as he was reflected in the sources from the Reverend Cotton Mather and from a couple of Boston's institutions. So, for instance, when he came to the Mather household in 1706, the minister decided, I put upon him the name of Onesimus, choosing this name from the Christian epistles, a name associated with slavery. And yet, of course, this man, and Mather called him a young man, so he is not just a child. This man must have had an identity before. We don't know what that identity was. We don't know whether he was born in Africa. Well, sorry, we know that he was born in Africa. We don't know how he came to North America, whether he spent time in the West Indies, whether he came directly to Massachusetts. We don't really know how old he was. We only know that in 1706, at the end of that year, the Reverend Cotton Mather and his family was presented with this young man as a servant. It was rather common in New England in the 18th century for the minister, often even in small towns, the minister would have an enslaved servant, usually to help the minister's wife in the household. So there would be towns with rather few people, everybody a farmer or working in some related field, and the minister, and the one enslaved person in the town would belong to the minister. Here, the Reverend Cotton Mather was already known for being interested in preaching to and converting the Black inhabitants of Boston and the North End to Christianity. Now, that was his form of Congregationalist Christianity. He was a Puritan in his theology. He felt that that it was his duty as a minister and a Christian to convert and evangelize everyone he could find. He wrote, as Tom said, as early as 1693, he was creating what he called the Society of Negroes, society meaning a congregation here of people to whom he preached. And then in 1706, the same year that eventually his congregation brought Onesimus to him, he wrote a book called The Negro Christianized. This was he really felt this duty to bring the gospel as he understood it to everyone, including people of African descent. Now, Onesimus didn't make this easy. What we see in the Reverend Cotton Mather's diaries over and over is that he'll mention Onesimus. Often it is something, a sad event, like Onesimus losing a child or being sick or some other problem in the household. Always follow this up with two things. One is, and he hoped that this would make Onesimus more pious. They hoped that this would move Onesimus to accepting membership in the Christian church. And then after that, he always upbraided himself for not having succeeded in doing that already. The Cotton Mather really felt this very keenly. So there are times when he realized that this wasn't working very well. And in August 1713, or about 7 years after Onesimus had come to the household, he wrote in his diary, "My Negro servant is one more easily governed and managed by the principles of reason, agreeably offered unto him, than by any other methods. I would oftener call him aside and essay to reason him into good behavior." So obviously in those previous 7 years, he had been trying all sorts of other things. He had been probably trying punishment. He had been trying yelling. He had been trying appeals to religion and things like that. But he realized that Onesimus was his equal in reason, that he had to speak logically to this man. Now, as I say, Mather constantly wanted Onesimus to become a member of his church, his congregation. Maybe not necessarily the Old North Meeting House in the North End, but some form of Calvinist Congregationalist theology, which would mean feeling you were born again, becoming baptized, joining a church. Those rituals were how he formally saw the conversion. And Onesimus never went through them, at least as a member of the Mather household. And this was a constant burden on the minister, who was, of course, not only supposed to be, he was the leading minister in Boston at the time, but he had also written these books about how you Christianize your Negro. He was supposed to be the expert. He did have, Onesimus, we can see through Mather's diary, was creating a life for himself in a way, as much as he could within the situation where his life belonged to another. By 1712, Mather, the minister, wrote that he had allowed unto my servant Onesimus the conveniences of the married state, which meant that Onesimus at that point had a wife. And at the same time, he was still having his children catechize Onesimus, to ask Onesimus the series of questions about religious beliefs and have him recite back to him. So he was still seeing this person as both a married man, a grown man, eventually within the next couple of years having children, and yet also almost a family pet to be looked after by the children. In 1714, for the first time, we see Onesimus burying a son, as the minister wrote. And again, the minister said that he hoped that this would be an occasion for him to become more pious. Then again in 1716, another son died. In the crucial month for the story that we're talking about today is July 1716, because in that month, Mather first writes back to the Royal Society in London, having read this article about smallpox inoculation in Turkey. He writes back about having inquired of my Negro man Onesimus, who was a pretty intelligent fellow, whether he had ever had the smallpox. He answered both yes and no, and then told me that he had undergone an operation which had given him something of the smallpox and would forever preserve him from it. And so at this point, in July 1716, Mather is speaking to the scientific community of the British Empire about what he has learned from Onesimus. At the end of that month, July 31st, he wrote in his diary, my servant Onesimus proves wicked and grows useless, froward, immorigerous, which meant rude. My disposing of him and my supplying of my family with a better servant in his room requires much caution, much prayer, much humiliation before the Lord. So in the same month that he was writing to London about what he had learned from Onesimus, which could save lives, he was also saying that this man is too rude to keep around in my household anymore, and I have to find a way to get rid of him. Now, it would have been possible, it would have been perfectly legal for the minister to sell Onesimus to someone else in Boston. It would have been legal for him to sell this man and his family, if Mather owned them all, off to the West Indies, where there was always a market for enslaved men. Mather didn't do that. In fact, he came to this decision that he would simply, as he wrote it out, free Onesimus and replace him with a younger and presumably more tractable servant. Now, the great source on this is Catherine Koo's article, Strangers in the House of God, which you'll see in the resource list at the end of this. It really goes into the sources and discusses and analyzes them in detail. There is a memorandum that exists in Captain Mather's handwriting, describing, sort of laying out a contract of what he will do with Onesimus in 1716 or 1717. It looks like, I call it a contract, but it was not actually a contract with Onesimus. It was a contract between Mather and himself, explaining what he was committing himself to and what he felt Onesimus was obliged to do. And as Tom said, the way it was set out, Onesimus was going to pay money for the Mathers to buy a younger man, a boy in fact, to replace him doing the household chores. Onesimus was supposed to commit to coming back to the household to continue to do some of those chores when he was very needed. When there was, they needed a lot of firewood, they needed the walks shoveled, i.e., things that maybe Mather wanted Onesimus especially, to look after his Mather's wife, the minister's wife. And furthermore, although he also felt that Onesimus had come to the money that he was paying for this other servant, he had come to it while being the Mather's slave, which meant that really that money should have gone to Mather in the first place, the minister felt. So he did feel that once Onesimus was freed, he should repay that money. It is very interesting that Mather is not simply saying, I'm going to let him buy his freedom. It was all couched in this moving money around from one pocket to another to come up with this replacement enslaved boy. But yet that was really what had happened, that Onesimus had found a way, wearing the minister down intellectually, making a life for himself within Boston with a wife and possibly children, and coming up with this money to make a case for himself to be free. One interesting part of this document that Cotton Mather wrote out, as Professor Kuhn noted, is that he wrote a series of obligations for himself later and then crossed them out. That he was not supposed to be obligated any further to support Onesimus if Onesimus became ill or old. This was sort of a unstated contract within New England society that if your enslaved person became disabled or old, that you would continue to support them. You would not just cast them out on the street. And this was a great source of tension and arguments. And Cotton Mather felt this obligation, and then he decided, no, if he was freeing this man, he no longer was under any need to look after him. So in 1717, it looks like, Onesimus became free. And on October of that year, Mather wrote in his diary, "A strange providence of God has brought into my family a new servant, a Negro boy of promising circumstances." And he named this boy Obadiah. And we know rather little about Obadiah after that. He just does not show up in the diary the same way. Now that was all in 1717. As Tom said, it was in 1721, 4 years later, that the smallpox epidemic broke out. And that was when Mather looked back on this man who had now been out of his household, whom he had replaced, whom he was no longer writing about, and thought about what Onesimus had told him about smallpox inoculation. And again, in 1724, Mather wrote about that whole episode and the controversy about it in a manuscript called The Angel of Bethesda. So even though Onesimus was no longer his servant, and we don't know if he ever came back to shovel the walk or anything like that, he nevertheless could not stop thinking about what he had learned about this man. Now, at this point, we no longer have sources from the Mather household about Onesimus. We have to look in other places. And one of those places is the church records of Boston, and another is the municipal records. In 1725 and then in 1727, men named Onesimus were married in two different churches in Boston. However, we don't know which, if either of those, were the Mather's former servant, because under the customs of the time, black men were usually referred to only by their first name, and B, a great many of the everybody knew about this epistle of Paul and the use of the word Onesimus as the name of an enslaved person. So there were more than one man named Onesimus in Boston. Both of these men named Onesimus who married in the 1720s had children. We can see that in the church records. So let's assume one of them was this former servant from the Mather household. He was once again building a family with a wife and child. then there's another custom which gives us a slight glance of Onesimus. Back in 1707, the year after the man had come to the Mather household, Massachusetts had passed a law that allowed the selectmen of towns to draft free black men to work on the roads and mend the roads. Now, the logic behind this law was that free black men were not allowed to drill with the militia. Free white men from the age of 16 to 60 had to. So that was a sort of tax on white men's labor, and yet black men were excluded. Now, of course, it was exclusion, but nevertheless, it was also an excuse. They were not excused from labor. And well, that wasn't fair. The government decided. So instead of drilling a few times a year as militia soldiers, the free black men were supposed to give their labor to work on the roads. And so starting in the very early 1700s, we periodically see lists of the free black men in Boston in the selectmen records, which list their names and how many days they are obligated to work on the roads that year. And in 1725, that list includes a man named Onesimus. And in 1738, the selectmen drafted 16 men for 2 days' work, including one man who is listed in the records as Onesimus Mather. And that indicates that, 1738, it is more than 20 years after he has become free. It is more than 30 years after he first came to the Reverend Cotton Mather's household. This man has adopted the Mather name. He is still working in Boston. He has made a life for himself as a free man. He has outlived his former owner, and he is participating in society, keeping himself out of the poorhouse, doing work, probably raising a family, because we see another generation of men named Onesimus. And so we know that Onesimus Mather survived the experience of being in the Reverend Cotton Mather's household and went on to have his own independent life. We don't know if what his religious views were. We don't know what his profession was, but we know that he provided something not only to Boston, but to the British Empire and to what became the United States of America, because through the inoculation against smallpox, this allowed some of the people in the next generation to survive. People like George Washington, people like John Adams, they underwent the smallpox or the smallpox inoculation. They understood the situation, the medical needs much better because of what this man had done back in the 1700s, about 1710, as an enslaved person, bringing knowledge from Africa to the Reverend Cotton Mather. So thank you.
Well, great. Fascinating. Thank you to both of you. And now I'm going to go and we'll try to answer some of the questions. And if you still have questions, I want you to please write them, type them in the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many as possible. We're going to go ahead and end this at sorry, I'm not on Eastern time, but at 2:15. So if we'll be around here with the authors. So I'm going to address this question to JL because I think you addressed it somewhat, but is there any information on Onesimus's faith? And do we have his original name, which might provide a clue as to whether or not he was Muslim?
We do not know Onesimus's original name. The Reverend Cotton Mather did not put that in his diary. He simply decided that he was going to call this man Onesimus. We don't know his faith. We do know that Mather was interested in religion. He did write down about obviously the inoculation. So he may, if he had come across that, he may have noted that as well, but he didn't. We also don't know when Onesimus, when these men named Onesimus got married in the 1720s. They were doing so within the big Congregationalist churches in town, the descendants of the Puritan meetings. And so, but you did not have to become a member of those churches to actually get married in them. It was basically a way to try to get you to become a member, that the ministers would marry you. There is no record of a man of that name, Onesimus Mather, joining any of the churches in a formal way. And so we really don't know what his faith was. We don't know what his background was. We don't know indeed whether he was Muslim or what his society was in Africa, except that he did, according to Mather's diary, he was from the Coromantee region.
Great. Anything else, Tom? Did you want to add anything?
No, I think, thank you, Gerald.
Great. I'm going to go back to a question that was actually asked before this about, because it's being asked again, what evidence do we have about the inoculation and the fact that it's an African creation?
Well, it was discovered in Africa as well as elsewhere. I think the reference to it being an African invention might have been used by some of its detractors in Boston as a way of kind of belittling it. It was certainly created in Africa, but there's a lot of evidence more or less at the same time, also probably even earlier. In China, for example, it was common to take the scabs of someone who had had smallpox, crush them into a powder, and then actually blow them through a long pipe into the nostrils of someone to inoculate. About the same time as Mather's project, Lady Montagu, who was a prominent British aristocrat, she lived in Turkey for a time and became a huge advocate for inoculation, had a number of family members inoculated. And also there's evidence of its use in Russia and elsewhere in various formats. There were many different ways of giving it. In colonial, in this era of Boston, it was generally given by making an incision of a sort, rubbing in some live lymph. There was skill involved on Boylston's part because it worked best when the sample of the live, smallpox and the lymph was taken from someone with a mild version. You would not want to do that from someone who had virulent smallpox. But there were different ways of inoculating for it in different parts of the world. There was a reference in, I think, one of Douglas's satiric writings about a walnut shell. Early on, this later changed, but they would actually put a walnut shell over the wound and kind of attach that to the arm or wherever the incision had been, to prevent from scratching. There's a very, I'm not sure that I think it's maybe a little Hollywood, but there is a very graphic image in the HBO film about John Abigail Adams of inoculation.
That is an interesting scene in the HBO miniseries, and yet it's very important to look at what Abigail Adams was actually writing in her letters at the time about having her family inoculated. In the scene, possibly because of budget, possibly because of dramatic purposes, the family, the little nuclear family, is at home in Braintree, all lying around being sick. In real life, Abigail got her whole household and some neighbors and the servants, went into Boston, went to the inoculation hospital. So it was a much more institutionalized process by the 1700s. And that is because of what Mather and Onesimus and Zeb Bill Boylston and others were able to accomplish. It went from being an almost underground, dangerous procedure to being one where you had a hospital set aside for it, and everybody knew where you went and what the procedures were and how you kept safe, and there were professional inoculators. So we can see the progress of medical science over the course of just a few decades, really, in the 1700s.
JL's comment brings to mind an irony that is sort of obvious, I guess, in this whole saga. You know, on the side of religion, we had the people who were pressing science, who were doing something very experimental, scary, iffy, but who were basically right in their core assumption. And on the more progressive side of secularism, we had, you know, the party who was adamantly opposed to it. There were positive, accurate points on both sides. Douglas and the Currentiers and others were correct in a lot of their criticism, particularly of how this was done. Boylston, for example, didn't really properly quarantine people after they'd been treated for this. Although they did keep very careful records, and for the day, this was pretty serious science, and the start of some good procedures. But much of the actual criticism was correct, and you can understand Douglas's frustration being the only really properly trained physician in Boston, even though his core assumption that it was a hoax was he backed the wrong horse.
Great. And just to follow up, how do we know about the inoculations of, say, George Washington and John Adams? Did they write about them, or where do we know that information? Where does that come from?
In the case of John Adams, he wrote about it in his diary. He wrote about going into Boston with a friend in the early 1760s when he was a young man, and going to one of these smallpox hospitals. The junior physician, he sort of grabbed by one guy and given the inoculation, and his friend was taken by another man who, a junior physician named Dr. Joseph Warren, who later became the Adams family physician and a close friend and political colleague, and died in the Battle of Bunker Hill. So we can see relationships being created within the smallpox inoculation process. In George Washington's case, I think he may have actually, if I recall right, contracted the disease naturally while he was on a trip to Barbados, and it was a mild form of the disease, which nevertheless left him with facial scarring, which shows up in some of his pictures, but also left him with this lifelong immunity that allowed him to remain healthy even when there was a much bigger epidemic during the Revolutionary War. Another person who dealt with smallpox later was Benjamin Franklin, of course, and as a young father in Philadelphia, he chose not to have his children inoculated, and one of them died of this, and he wrote in his autobiography late in life about how this was possibly his biggest regret in life.
Well, Christopher is asking, should we be considering Onesimus's refusal to convert as an act of resistance? Do other instances of resistance appear in Mather's diary besides his July complaints about Onesimus being difficult?
Mather, the minister, occasionally complained about Onesimus thieving, stealing something. He doesn't say what. He doesn't say the how he defines this. Now, of course, he is taking this man's labor for himself. So the way we define thievery is all in the eyes of the beholder. It may be that Onesimus was actually taking household goods and using them for himself and selling them, or taking money. It may be that he was not doing that, that he was, doing an odd job outside of the household, earning money and keeping it for himself instead of turning it over to the Reverend Cotton Mather. Both of those would have been seen as taking resources that truly belong to the owner, and therefore could be seen as theft. But so we know that in that regard, Mather felt that Onesimus needed to be corrected. There were other moments where it's not just when he complains and he says he has to dispose of Onesimus in some way. Mather talks about him being rude, talks about him being forward, talks about him being, I think one might have to use the word uppity, that he was not acting in the way that he expected an enslaved servant and a servant of African descent to act. So in that regard, I think that yes, there were areas, there were ways that Onesimus was resisting the enslaved status that he was forced into.
Tom, did you have anything to add?
No, JL has certainly got a broader scope of knowledge about Onesimus than I, so
Yeah, okay.
thank you for that.
And Larissa wants to know what kind of information is there on indigenous tribes and what they were doing regarding inoculation, if anything.
That is an interesting question.
Go ahead, Jim.
And I don't know seriously at this point, because the area, the time of in which I study, the indigenous tribes have been pushed away, warred against, so that they did not really have an autonomous society close to Boston. It was farther away. I think that Elizabeth Fenn's book, Pax Americana, is possibly a good source for this. It talks about the smallpox epidemic that really went across North America during the Revolutionary War. And she talks about, she wrote about the experience of the smallpox, not just in the narrow band of the eastern seaboard where the British colonists lived and were revolting, but also what was happening in the west of North America, in the Spanish areas, in the areas where indigenous nations were still living independently, because the smallpox was no respecter of national boundaries or ethnic boundaries.
Yeah, I didn't run across any specific references in my reading, my research to Indians being inoculated. And as I mentioned, Dr. Boylston, Zeb Bill Boylston, grew up on the frontier, as it were, had a lot of interaction with Indians. And I think knowing how he felt about inoculation and that he had connections there, I think if he could have, he probably would have. My guess is also, given their history with diseases introduced by Europeans, I think inoculation would have been a particularly hard sell to that community. So I'm not aware, certainly in this era anyway, that it was actively used in the Indian community.
And just to stick with inoculation again, there's been questions about who recorded the first claim to the first recorded inoculation, and where was that in the world? And then also, what are the implications of this story on the commonly accepted belief that Edward Jenner invented the smallpox vaccine in 1776? And yeah.
There's a clear answer on that one. The process that was used here, that was advocated here, was inoculation, also called variolation. And one of the reasons this was considered so dangerous, and was in fact quite dangerous, it was antithetical to take this live virus, and there was danger in it. And Boylston did lose a few patients, but statistically, when the analysis was complete, it was clear that this was working. And the survival rate was much higher for those who'd been inoculated. But nonetheless, they were inoculating with live virus, although they didn't know it was a virus. Jenner used a lesser virus, basically, as the answer to the question. It was noted in his time that in some cases that milkmaids, young women who milked cows, generally didn't get smallpox. And this led him to research and eventually come to the knowledge that a lesser virus, lesser form, cowpox, could be used. And actually the Latin root for cow is vacca, and it's where vaccination comes from. He used essentially the cowpox virus, which was less virulent, but that did give protection against smallpox as well. As far as where it was discovered first, it may have been first in Asia. I'm not certain about that. I don't know if there's any one point in time when it's been tracked as far as it originated here at this point in this time. But it did crop up in various parts of the world through, as I mentioned, different means of application.
We now know that the smallpox virus, the cowpox virus, other viruses or germs are small living creatures that are reproducing in a different way. Interestingly, the first person on record to have the idea that maybe diseases come from little creatures created like other creatures, except very, very tiny and very, very special. One of the first people to come up with that idea is the Reverend Cotton Mather in his unpublished writings. So he was scientifically rather advanced, although theologically he was rather conservative.
He called them animalcules, I think. Was that? Yeah.
Yes, yes, little animals.
That was the original, yeah. Somehow we changed it to bacteria and virus, and he was onto something.
That's really fascinating. We're going to only have time for one more question, but there have been several questions asking about general information about the slave trade, for instance, statistics about the slave trade and how slavery was practiced or existed in New England at the time, and you know, what happened when a slave was freed and so on. And I wonder if either of you or both of you have a reference or some kind of place that folks can go to find the answers to those questions, because we're not going to have time to get to those.
There have been a number of studies of slavery and of African Americans in New England in colonial and early federal times. One is called Black Yankees. Another I can think of has a more scholarly title, like the Negro in Colonial New England by Green. So it is possible to find books about the population as a whole or the institution of slavery as a whole, and they're quite good. Occasionally there are books about individuals, such as Vincent Corretta's biography of Phyllis Wheatley, that explores the experience of slavery through an exceptional person who left a lot of records, and whom we can see in that case moving from slavery to freedom, much like Onesimus Mather, by basically wowing her owners with her intelligence until they realized that they could not keep her enslaved any longer.
And I might just mention and recommend John Hope Franklin's book, From Slavery to Freedom, which is about 800 pages long and covers the history of enslavement, relationships with Europe, the development of the slave trade, domestic and internationally. And he covers in that book, there's a lot of good material about slavery in New England before the Revolutionary War. After the Revolutionary War, many states in New England that became states did away with slavery. But at the time of the Revolutionary War, slavery was practiced in all 13 of the colonies. And there's good treatment of that in John Hope Franklin's book.
Great, thank you. Well, we're really winding down to our last minute or two, but I would not be a very good journalist if I didn't ask your response to how inoculation was discussed in the newspaper. And you could have a whole program on that, because I know it was discussed voluminously. But if you could each both just take a brief second to try to answer that question from Marion.
Yes, well, it's interesting. In the Courant was certainly the vehicle for it in Boston. The other publications were more or less, I mean, if not officially, but they were considered semi-official publications, sort of affiliated with a power structure in the state. But the Courant was almost universally anti-inoculation. It's interesting that most of the commentary on it was anonymous, and certainly it's a lot easier to submit something anonymously. One sort of very intriguing fact related, I ran across in my research on that. Some years ago, a copy of the Courant was discovered, which had been marked with markings. And it turns out, and this had been undiscovered for a long period of time, and it was something that it's believed Benjamin Franklin did, where he put the initials next to anonymous submissions, designating who it was that wrote it in the community. It's quite an intriguing record. Otherwise, we might not know some of the anonymous submitters of these, but I think the fact that they were submitted anonymously speaks to is a very difficult time and a very difficult politics involved.
I can only add that none of the newspapers in town were really going concerns as businesses yet. They were either under the patronage of officials like the postmaster, or they were being supported by men like Dr. William Douglas and his circle, who wanted to have this anti-establishment voice. So the newspapers were, we can say that the Courant was independent of the government, but really all of these newspapers in their editorial sides were the voice of particular factions within the town. And the printers themselves, they might ally themselves with certain factions, but they were not them. There was no idea of a newspaper publisher as being a power unto himself. Mm-hmm. So really, basically the Courant was created to have this argument, and it did. It really went after the establishment so much that James Franklin was periodically put in jail.
Interesting. Stephen Cross is the author of one of the books we're going to recommend to you in a minute, The Fever of 1721. But he's been quoted as saying, and he's quite serious about this, that he feels that the Courant was in its day the version of The Onion or The Daily Show, or he said the Colbert Report, because this was some years ago, but he very much felt that that was completely the same niche it was filling in that era as those products now.
That's a good segue, Deborah. Shall we go ahead and put up the slide with, these are some of our favorite sources. You've heard many of them referenced in the course of our presentation today. And I'll tell you what, you might want to just take a quick screenshot of this, since we're not going to have time to dwell on the slide. But you'll be getting an email from me before too long with a link to the recording of this program when it comes up. And I'll just make a commitment now to include this information in that email. And then Deborah, do you have any closing words before we, I wanted to make an announcement about our next program, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to close up if you like.
No, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in, and also thank you again, Blair, for organizing it, and to the Freedom Forum, and of course to the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations for their generous support, and perhaps most importantly to Tom and John for their wisdom on this fascinating topic. I feel like I could sit here for another couple hours and just listen to you guys. So thank you so much to everybody, and thank you for the invitation to participate.
Thank you, and I
Thank
certainly
you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Tom and to J.L. Bell and to Dr. Deborah Mason. And I'll just mention that we'll be right back here this time next week at 1 o'clock on Thursday, October the 8th. We're going to acknowledge and honor the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from prohibiting African-American men the right to vote. And it's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which of course prohibited states from keeping women away from the franchise. But as soon as these amendments passed, resistance raised its ugly head, and efforts at voter suppression and other forms of suppression of full participation in our democracy began to take place. So we're going to hear from the Reverend Billy Michael Honor, who's with the New Georgia Project, who's going to tell us about 33 Georgia legislators elected to office during Reconstruction and then immediately expelled because of their color. And we're going to hear from Lacey Wilson, also the director of the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum in North Carolina, about efforts that Charlotte Hawkins Brown took to make sure that women had the right, African-American women had the right to vote. So please join us then, and thank you again to everyone for your participation. Goodbye.
Bye.